Welcome to the Farming on Purpose podcast, a podcast for farmers and ranchers ready to shift for a stronger future. Today's challenges in agriculture are new, but the grit and determination required to be successful are not. On the Farming on Purpose podcast, you'll hear how producers of all sizes and practices are moving mountains for things they believe in, all in the name of an industry that keeps growing and innovating for a stronger food system and stronger farm families. I'm your host, Lexi Wright, and I'm excited to discuss where producers are finding success, challenging the status quo, striving for better, and keeping our heritage alive, all while producing the food we depend on. Welcome back to Farming on Purpose. Today it is just me here recording with you, and today's episode is the style that I actually planned on doing a lot more of when I started this podcast. We're going to be taking a deep dive into some history. And when I started this podcast, I thought, I'm going to do so many of these episodes. There's so many topics I want to talk about. And the research and the time commitment that it takes to put one of these episodes together was just not feasible for me. So I'm really excited to do this episode today. And if you appreciate this style, I would love to hear from you. If this is beneficial to you or kind of helps your line of thinking about things, it helped mine a lot as I put it together. But I would love to know if it's something that you like and something that I should make time to do more of in the future. So today's episode is about resource allocation in agriculture. And I think if you zoom out far enough, agriculture has basically always been about resource allocation. Every farmer that I know is making decisions right now about what to do with what they have. Whether that's, a particular piece of land, what to do with their time, what to do with their money, how to manage their relationships, how to manage their coworkers or their employees. It's a lot of resource allocation. And usually in the moment, it doesn't feel always like this executive decision that you get to make, where you get to sit down and look at all the information on a piece of paper and then say, okay, this is the best path forward. When I think about resource allocation, I think that's how I would like to make decisions, but that is not always how we get to make those decisions. A lot of times in the moment, they feel heavy because you're weighing a lot of factors that maybe don't make sense on paper, or there's things that these outside forces that are happening in how you allocate your resources. And some of that's political, some of that's seasonal. There's just so much that goes into it. And I think that's why, we all know in agriculture, risk is such a big factor. And I think that's one of the resources that we're managing is our tolerance for risk. And a personal note, I took 6 months away from this podcast over the summer, and that stretched into the fall. And that was because I needed to step back and ask the same question about my own life. It's not just about resources that are hard, physical things. It's about the resource of energy too. And I had to evaluate where my energy was being directed at that time. And because of that step back that I took over the summer, I've decided that going forward, this podcast is not going to be a thing that happens in the summer. It is not a good allocation of my resources and my energy during that season. And as you hear kind of the different pieces of this podcast, I hope that you consider how that might impact your own life and your own operation. And as we think about some of the episodes that I've been doing lately on the podcast, transition planning, tax strategy, these things are basically the modern expression of this question that agriculture has always asked of what do we do with what we have and who carries it forward? And those questions feel so big as we think about the amount of land that is going to change hands, about the number of beginning and first-time farmers and ranchers who are going to be taking on operations and working on the challenges that we have. So, without further ado, let's dive in to how we got here from a resource allocation standpoint. In the first era that I'm going to talk about, I'm going to call it the subsistence and survival era. So this was pre-1800s to, 1850, around that time frame. The world at that time was pretty unforgiving. And I think that farming reflected that. Most people lived where they were born. You didn't move around a lot. Life expectancy was often under 40 years old. And even just one harvest that didn't go the way that it should have could mean that your family would have a very rough winter and could starve. Safety nets like crop insurance, government programs, supply chains that could allow you to buy some of those groceries in, it wasn't a thing. And food security, well, what we call food security now, was deeply personal. Back then, I think it mainly just was called hunger. So farming during that time wasn't really about profit or efficiency, which is almost the only thing that we talk about when we talk about farming from a business side today. It was really about continuity. It was about figuring out how you could survive on what you had. You had your gardens, you had your livestock. There was a lot more hunting and gathering at that time, bartering. This was how people were diversifying their resources and trying to get the best that they could for what they had through exchange. Putting all of your resources into one thing was absolutely unheard of. There was no such thing as a cattle farm. There was no such thing as, a chicken operation. Everything was completely diversified because the idea was that if you had a bad crop year, hopefully you were able to, survive on some of these other things. At this time, yields were pretty low by modern standards, or what we would think today. Wheat averaged roughly 12 to 15 bushels an acre, and corn was about 25 bushels an acre. One farmer could realistically only manage 10 to 20 acres. They primarily were using hand tools and animal power. And just as a note, a lot of these statistics that I'm going to use today are coming from a history of agriculture in the United States, which is a USDA resource, and from the US Census historical data. And if I have any others, I'll try to drop them along as I kind of mention statistics. But if you do have any questions about anything I mentioned specifically, feel free to reach out. So during this time then, by about 1850, that's kind of towards the end of this era that we're talking about, the US had about 1.4 million farms. They were mostly small, they were mostly family run, and they were mostly to feed the family that lived on the farm. During this time, I think that Thomas Jefferson is a useful kind of anchor here, not because he was a founding father, but he was a farmer. At Monticello, he obsessively recorded weather patterns, soil conditions, crop outcomes. A lot of his experimentation wasn't, science, or it wasn't just for the study. It was driven by anxiety over failure. Having a crop loss meant that everybody that was tied to his property was going to have instability, was going to have hunger, was going to have a hard time. And so he had that responsibility to care for the land, to care for his crops, to provide. And, there's a lot of other things about Thomas Jefferson that went on during that time, but from this standpoint, I think that he is a good person to mention because of the documentation and the studying he was doing to try to just kind of improve his results. It wasn't always that way. It wasn't well documented necessarily during the time what people were doing on farms. They were just trying to get by. So how this connects is that, when your margin for error is basically zero, you really value reliability over innovation. Labor and seed were the scarcest resources, and every decision that you had to make, you had to ask the same question, and that was, will this keep us alive this winter? I think that that's important to consider about how people made decisions at that time and how that shaped agriculture and farms and ranches that we see today. This period of time was important because it shaped how people thought, and it shaped the decisions that they made because of the resources that they had. Now, as we think about transitioning into the next era, really what changed here is that settlement expanded west. So the number of farms started to grow from 1.4 million that we were at in about 1850 to 2.6 million by 1870. So only 20 years, and we have, doubled the number of farms virtually. It's an increase of nearly 90% of the number of farms in just 20 years, which, man, what a wild time to be alive, in my opinion. I think that would have been incredible to see. But that brings us to the Homestead era, which is all about expansion, and it was all about ownership. A lot of the farms that were in that early era, ownership wasn't necessarily always the situation. At this point, land was more like it was security. It was kind of about identity too. So during this era, there was the Civil War, which changed how labor worked. It changed how land ownership worked. It changed transportation because we had railroads connecting farms to markets that they couldn't reach before. Immigration surged during this era. And then we also see the Industrial Revolution take place. So massive change, massive transformation. The Homestead Act of 1862 opened about 270 million acres of federal land to settlers who were willing to improve it. And they were getting 160-acre plots if they were willing to just go grab it. So between 1860 and 1905, the number of farms, that's why it grew during this time. But during that time in the early Homestead Act era, the number of farms grew from 2 million to nearly 6 million. So an even bigger increase than we saw in that 20-year expansion after the 1850s. And by 1900, there were 5.7 million farms that all averaged about 140 acres, 146 acres to be exact. During this time, expansion was really logic. People were expanding because of the dream of something for themselves. It was about that ownership. It was about the identity that they were making a life for themselves and striking out on their own. So when they were expanding like this, exhaustion was a big part of what happened during this time because of just the absolute tax that it took to not only travel to get to the land, but then to start it from scratch. If you couldn't figure out how to grow once you got there, that was failure. That was a loss. So during this time, I think that we did kind of adopt a belief in agriculture that we still see today, and that's if you're not expanding, you're falling behind. The Ingalls family, which, everybody knows Laura Ingalls Wilder, are pretty symbolic of this area or this era. They cleared land, they lost crops to weather. You read their books, there's blizzards, there's hunger, but they still believed, even with all of that risk, that land ownership represented opportunity. They moved multiple times through Laura's life, but they didn't see those things as failures. They saw them as hope or responses to scarcity. It's like, there's not enough here. Let's go where there's more opportunity. And I think that's important during this time. There was a lot of hope about the future during the Homestead era because things were changing so quickly. When we get past that, we're kind of moving to era 3, which is all about industrialization. This is the 1910s and to the 1940s is kind of how I'm breaking it down. And at this point, we see machines enter as a response to labor loss. It really wasn't necessarily about convenience at the time. It was, some about convenience because it's much more convenient to drive a tractor than a team of horses. But also at this point, we had World War I and World War II, which took all of these young men from farms. And so we had a labor loss. Cities and factories also offered steady wages. So working on the farm was a bigger risk than other alternatives. The Great Depression happened during this time as well. So prices were collapsed. The Dust Bowl had some really harsh consequences. And into this came machines. So we had you talk about the hope of expansion just a few years prior to this to the devastation of multiple world wars, the Great Depression, the Dust Bowl. Man, it's just a turn the penny on its head kind of a situation. And then we have tractors come onto the scene. So the number of tractors in the U.S. exploded at this time. There were about 500 tractors in 1910. By 1920, there were 5,000. And by 1935, there were over 1 million. And this comes from the history of tractor adoption on encyclopedia.net. So that's pretty crazy to me to think that in 25 years, we go from less than 500 tractors in the US to over 1 million tractors. It's like it would go from there being one in your county that you could go see and be like, wow, this is cool, to everybody had one by the time that you were a kid to an adult. Pretty crazy. So during this period, agriculture's share of the US workforce dropped dramatically. It went from 37% in 1900 to only 18% by 1950. So we're seeing, a pretty serious drop there. And that data did come from USDA. Corn yields during this time rose about 50% between 1900 and 1940. And a lot of this was due to mechanization of the tractors and then fertilizer use, which increased during that time, according to Purdue Extension. During this time, I also think it's important to note that some of the reasons for this more productive crops, people weren't thinking about it as profit. They weren't saying, I need to increase the yields of my corn because I want to make more money. They were saying, I need that for stability. I need it so that I have some corn to hold back if I had a failed crop. I need it so that I'm not going to fail in a single year. Henry Wallace was an Iowa farmer, and he later became vice president, but he championed hybrid corn because of the idea of stability. It wasn't about profit. It wasn't about getting more bushels per acre. It was about buffering families from volatility. And I think that's a really important aspect of this time is it wasn't about more. It was about let's reduce risk. So machines at this time, again, replaced a lot of labor, but they also introduced some more risk in ways because of the debt associated with them. Efficiency at this time became, doing more with less wasn't necessarily optional. It was something that you either did or you invested the capital as the resource to manage. So money management during this era became much more significant. Before that, getting a loan, it wasn't as big of a deal. It wasn't as big of a sum. At this stage, you could invest a lot more capital in your operation because you could take on more debt. This kind of brings us into the next era, or the Green Revolution, which was the 1950s to the 1980s. And this, as the name suggests, really focused on science. And we started looking to science to find abundance, to find the ways that we could improve our crops to not have the risk of a failed one. After World War II, a lot of people had a lot of faith in institutions. So there was a lot of trust in the research that was being put out, in the ideas that were being put out, even if those ideas, were potentially harmful to some operations. People trusted the institutions. They trusted the voice of reason. There was a lot of population growth during this time, and hunger became a issue, like a political issue and a worldwide issue during the Cold War. And governments started to spend a lot more money in ag research at this time, because hunger, we were starting to realize hunger didn't have to be a thing. U.S. corn yields during this time climbed from about 40 bushels per acre in 1950 to about 130 bushels per acre by 1990, which is a 225% increase, and that stat comes from Purdue. Globally, cereal production more than doubled between 1961 and 1985. That stat's from the FAO. And then from 1948 to 2015, U.S. farm output increased by 170%, while total input use rose only 7%, meaning that output grew about 24 times faster than inputs. That statement right there, that is the turning point, in my opinion. That came from USDA as well. But that was, wow. You can only put 7% more in and get 170% more out. That is world changing right there. And when we talk about that, you have to mention Norman Borlaug. Norman Borlaug was a wheat breeder, and he believed that hunger could be solved. His work is credited with preventing mass famine and saving an estimated of 1 billion lives, which he was given a Nobel Prize for. And, I've seen some interesting things about the work that Norman Borlaug did, and people trying to kind of discredit it. And, I think that there's a time and a place for for most things. I won't say everything. But for Norman Borlaug, at this time, he saved lives. And did he did the science that he did create some side effects that some of us are not happy with today when we think about grains and how they're used? Yeah. There's a lot of people that are not happy with that. But the fact that he saved lives at the time is very powerful. At this time, knowledge replaced land as the growth engine. And that is really, really important to note, because it leads us kind of to where we are at again today. This question of, can you do more with less if you are smart enough to figure out how? Yield was the biggest measure of success at that time. And, diversity, everybody was encouraged not to diversify, but to go all in on one thing so that you could have the most bushels per acre on your one crop. And I think that as well has shaped some interesting things in agriculture today. The next era that I want to talk about is agribusiness and kind of globalization. So this was the 1980s to the 2010s. And at this point, we had the 1980s farm crisis. Global trade expanded and markets became a lot more volatile. So the 1980s farm crisis, I would love to do more in-depth episodes about, because it is just really interesting point in history for agriculture. But it gave way to these kind of debt-driven growth models of get big or get out, and interest rates went way up. Land values collapsed by, as much as 60% in parts of the Midwest. And you can do the math on your own land. What if your land was suddenly worth 60% less than it is now? What that could do to your operation, especially if you're in the middle of a transition. That would be devastating. I can only imagine. The number of farms fell from 6 million in 1935 to 2.1 million by 2000. So that's a big time frame. We're looking at about 70 years there, but it's a 65% decline during that time. So basically from the Dust Bowl, the Dirty 30s, and the Great Depression until 2000, we were on a constant decline of the number of farms. So the average farm size grew from about 146 acres in 1900 to 441 acres in 2002. So we're looking there, again, that's a 100-year time span. But that size of land is about 200% increase of the size of farms during that time. And the farm population dropped from 39% of Americans in 1900 to 1% by 2000. So we have increased the farm size by 200% and cut the workforce by 97%. You can really see how technology played a role and science played a role in the shifting of the hands there. During the 1980s and the 1980s farm crisis, farm families weren't necessarily doing anything wrong. They were doing everything right. They were doing everything that they could to manage their operations well, and still lost their operations. Suicide rates increased during this time, and that grief was rarely talked about. And I think that a lot of us can understand what that might look like. So how this connects, I think farming became systems management during this time. Risk, debt, markets, knowing your data, doing your research about what you were doing on your farm as far as technology, crop varieties, genetics, all of that is coming into play here. And at this time, off-farm income became insurance. So before that time, having an off-farm job was, there was other revenue streams. There was, side gigs that most farmers did, whether it was doing custom work or selling their cream in town, the things like that. But a full-time off-farm job at this point became insurance, so that if something like this 1980s farm crisis happened again, you wouldn't lose the farm, or you would hope to not lose the farm. And that brings us to today. This is the 2010s through 2026. Time, energy, and continuity are now the scarcest resources. Today's farmers operate in a world that is all about public scrutiny, and it's about constant connection to the resources that they have to grow, to the research, to the political environment. There is really no in between. Either you're plugged in and you're using the information that you can glean from these ever-changing things to try to make the best decisions and allocate the resources that you have on your farm to the best of your ability. We talk a lot about mental health, and those conversations are more public now than they used to be, but it's definitely not a problem that has been solved. Consumers want transparency in this age, and that was never a question before. Before then, it was, there is food, thank God. Now we have so many options, and we have so much more desire to have that transparency about the production practices and that knowledge, that background. The largest generational transfer of land in U.S. history is underway right now. So we are making history in agriculture right now, which I'd argue we've never not been making history in U.S. agriculture. It's just, we're such a young country that there's been so much that has shaped what ag looks like in our country. Today, the average U.S. farmer is about 58 years old. I think that's a stat we've all heard quite a bit. And an estimated 70% of farmland is expected to change hands in the next 20 years. I am going to be intrigued to see what that means for our industry. Looking back in time and seeing some of the things that happened in these short little 20-year spans that completely changed our world, and thinking about what that could look like in the next 20 years as 70% of farmland changes hands. That is an event. That is something that could change how everything in our world works. And I think that it's very important that we recognize that opportunity and that situation. From 2017 to 2024, the number of farms declined by about 8%, from 2.04 million to about 1.88 million. That's USDA data. And local food sales grew from 5 billion in 2008 to 12 billion in 2020, which is about a 140% increase. And I am glad that they cut that stat off in 2020, because I would be very interested to know what that percentage increase would be between 2020 and 2026, but I do not have that data yet. But I think that's fascinating. That's a huge increase as well, before COVID even came into play. The mindset that we think about in this era, I think, is really important. We are thinking about next generation producers. This conversation is being had constantly. I think it is one of the most prominent things that is happening in ag media right now. We see the political unrest, we see the crop prices, we see things about being drought tolerant, we see things about, managing your nutrient resources, and we see things about how do we make sure that the farms can survive? How can we still live this life? And I say that, not as like a person who's saying we need to continue to carry on the traditions. I think there's a lot that is good to be carried on, but I'm not saying that everything about this life is worth preserving or should be preserved as we move into the future. But that's kind of the stage that we are at, is we are thinking about the next generation. And it's weird for me personally to say that, I feel like, because we just moved to this farm that we bought from my husband's grandma coming up on 3 years ago. Holy cow, time flies. We are already thinking, we don't have that much time left here as the managers of this farm. If we want to set up the next generation to have an opportunity to do well and to make this farm a business that is feasible for them, our time is limited. We have to be thinking about that next generation if we want them to have even an opportunity to be successful, because the risk is so much greater. The capital investment required is so much greater at this point. That's something that it's just really weird for me to feel like I went from being a next generation producer to thinking about the next generation producer in a very short amount of time. So I don't know if anybody else feels that way, but it's kind of a weird thing to experience. At this point, I think, I've said this before, but sustainability in agriculture is not just environmental. It is personal, from a mental health standpoint. It is personal from a financial standpoint. It is personal from a ability to physically do the work standpoint. And it's also, it's generational. It's about what you're passing on to your kids from skills to their ability to have a relationship with you so that you can communicate that transition successfully. The limiting factor at this point is not land. And I think that a lot of folks think that it is with land prices what they are. And I agree. That's hard, but I don't think it's the biggest limiting factor. In today's world, where we are seeing such a massive increase of local food sales and new and innovative ag markets, land is not the limiting factor. Management is the limiting factor, and innovation is the limiting factor in how we move our farms forward in this era. I hope you can kind of see where I was going with this episode about in every era there was these big events. There were these world-changing events. And in every era, farmers and ranchers had to ask the same question. What do we do with what we have to make the most of it? Every era of agriculture has had to learn how to manage the resources that were most important to them at that time. And that usually meant the resource that was most scarce at that time. And as we think about some of these transition planning and tax strategy conversations that we've been having on the podcast, I want to just leave you with some questions to ask ourselves as individuals about how we set our operations up and how we set ourselves up for success in agriculture in this era that we are moving into, where we're going to see a massive change in the way that agriculture works because the land is changing hand at such a large scale. So the first question is, where is my energy actually going? I think we can do this by really documenting, maybe doing some journaling. I know that's hard. I use my phone. I use my notes app to do that primarily because I'm just not great about sitting down with a journal. But thinking about where that energy is being drained. What conversations are hard? What conversations are sticking with you a long time after they happened? What things are you trying to avoid? What things make your shoulders go tense? And just think about, what are those things? Think about where that energy is going. We really tend to ignore this, and we don't realize how much it holds us back. And I think, another sign of this is what tasks am I doing or thinking about that all of a sudden I want to reach for my phone and scroll instead of deal with the decision that I need to make? Or where do I suddenly decide that, folding the laundry is much more important than working on this? Those are the things that are draining your energy, and that are things that, there's a reason they're draining your energy. It's because they're not right. They're not aligned, or you feel like that you can't change them. You're not happy with them. Those are the things that need addressed. So I'm not saying you have to solve them, but I think you need to know what they are. The second question is, what resources am I protecting, and which ones am I spending quietly or maybe without knowing it? So resources, I really mean this from a very broad perspective. It could be time with your family, time with your spouse, time to just, sit and reflect. It could be your health. It could be your relationships with your community or things that are important to you off the farm. Your decision-making capacity. That's something that we know there is science proven that the more decisions we have to make in a day, the quality of those decisions goes down as we make more decisions. So if you are constantly making hundreds of decisions in a day, you are not protecting the resource that you have of that executive function to make good decisions. Figuring out ways that you can make less decisions in a day is going to help you make more good ones. In the past, generations protected land. And I think a lot of that's going to continue into this era in different ways. It's going to look different than it did before. But in this generation, and I think we're seeing trends to this, we need to decide to protect people the people, the less than 1% of people who are involved in production agriculture is incredibly important to protect. And I think you can take this as an approach to your operation as well. What resources are you protecting? Like, are you always worried about running out of something? Whether that's feed, whether that's, waiting to the last second to make the call on your LRP. What resources are you trying to protect and, maybe are not making the best decisions because of the stress that you feel about protecting them. Third question is, what am I still doing out of habit, not intention? So this is about looking at the things that you started doing one day for whatever reason, maybe because dad taught you, maybe because you just did it one day that way, or maybe because it felt easier at the time. What are you still doing that way, but it's really not the best way that you could be doing them? I admit this takes time, this takes resources to make a change from habits, especially if it is, a big picture affecting a big portion of your operation. But I think it's worth noting what things you're doing out of habit that you would not necessarily choose to do that way. Again, you don't have to solve it today. You could solve some of them. You can just note them and say, this is a challenge that I need to address, and I'm going to work on it in the future. The fourth question is, if I had to step away for 6 months, what would break and what would keep going? And holy cow, that's a question that I don't ever want to ask. So I guess that's maybe something that I should look at as a resource that I'm protecting. But if you had to step away for 6 months, what would break and what would keep going? I think the answer to that for a lot of us is everything. Everything would break. There would be hardly anything that would keep going. And that can tell us that, for one, a lot of everything that is happening on your operation relies on you. So the resource that you need to protect is you. And I think that that's a hard conversation to have with yourself. It forces you to make some decisions and maybe change some habits. But, some other examples of what could break down depending on what your operation looks like. It could be income. It could be leadership, if those things are falling to someone else that is not prepared to step into that role. It could be systems that you don't have documented well, or that, nobody knows except you because it lives in your head. It could be communication. It could be your self-worth, because if you're not doing it, then your identity is gone. And those things are worth recognizing before they happen. And another question for 5 is, what problem am I actually solving with my operation? Now, this one, I think, is something that tells us a lot about the future, because a lot of us may not know what problem we're solving with our operation. It could be because, we just, this is our farm. This is how we farm. This is what we do. But what are you doing with your farm? What is its benefit to the world? And you may know it. You may know what everybody tells you it is. But I think it's a question worth asking yourself, because if you don't 100% know it, it is affecting your operation, because you have a lot of doubt in your purpose that you maybe are not addressing. So you're solving a problem of food security, of income for your family, of legacy for your family, of, it could be anything. It depends on your operation, but answering this question, I think, is important. Number 6 is, where am I allocating resources reactively instead of strategically? So this is kind of similar to the habits questions, but it's things that maybe you're doing because you run out of time or because an opportunity comes up. There's a lot to be said for this one. I'm not going to dwell on this one too much, because I think that there's a lot of opportunities in ag that come up that you cannot strategically plan for, because you didn't know they existed. You didn't know that opportunity was going to knock on your door. But there are some things that, you can strategically plan for, like where you're going to expand, how you're going to do things on your own operation as it stands today, how you're going to manage labor on your operation, taxes, purchases, planning out what you're going to buy instead of buying when something breaks because you have to, which that's never fun. The next question is, am I building something that can be transferred or only something that I personally carry? Again, if everything relies on you, then you don't have an operation that is going to go through a transition or a succession very easily. And if that's not your goal, okay, that's fine. If you don't have a successor identified, that's fine. But I'm going to encourage you to think about how you could set it up so that you could have the option to transition your operation, because a successor might come along. You don't know. Or you might decide that when you go to sell, you want to sell it to somebody that's going to operate it as a farm versus not as a farm. And I think that that's an important question to ask yourself if that matters to you. I hope it matters to you with the amount of land that is about to be transferred. So thinking about systems, background knowledge about how the farm was built or how things were done that worked or didn't work, or, how your ownership structure is set up, all of those things are important to think about when we think about what you're building and where it can go. The next question is, what resource will matter most in the next 20 years? This might look different for your operation versus the neighbors, and it might be something that's really hard to answer right now because we don't know what the world is going to look like in 20 years. But I think we all have an idea of things that, those resources that we want to protect for our kids, those opportunities that we want to be able to provide them. Is the resource of our kids having skills that are going to carry them forward? Like, is that going to matter in 20 years? Is it having access to land? Is it the ability to communicate with consumers? There's going to be things that you think are important today, and in 20 years we'll be like, why did we think that was important? And there's things that we know are going to be important. I've got 2 more questions. So number 9 is, what does sustainability really mean in my context? And I talked about this a little bit already. Sustainability is not just about our decisions that we make when it comes to the environment. Sustainability has to be sustainable for the farm family. It has to be sustainable for the one doing the work. If it's not sustainable. So financial stability, emotional stability, generational sustainability. But, all of these things matter and have to be part of the conversation. Environmental sustainability, yes, still important. At the same time, we have to ask those same questions. Okay, and then the last question is, who needs to be part of these conversations now before it's urgent? So a lot of this is, ask yourself, what do you think? What reflection do you have on these questions? But if you are building an operation that you hope to be still operating when you are done operating it, you have to bring other people into these conversations, whether that's a family member, whether it's partners, the next generation, advisors who can help you make changes. Who needs to be part of these conversations before you maybe don't have the opportunity to have them? The message that I want to leave you with at the end of this episode here is that I think history shows us that agriculture, it doesn't fail or stop working in a certain way, like when we see these change between eras. That doesn't happen because people stop working. It happens, like, agriculture starts to struggle as a whole when we keep allocating resources the same way that we did, even after the world has changed. Paying attention to the change in the world and letting that affect what we do on our farms. A lot of us try to shelter our farms from it, but letting it affect what we do on our farms is important. Just some final wrap-up notes on this episode, because I've been meaning to record them for quite a while and I haven't got it done. So I'm going to put them here. This episode and all of our podcast episodes are now available on Patreon. And that is a great way to support the podcast. If you have found value in the Farming on Purpose podcast in the past, please check us out on Patreon to see ways that you can support the podcast and the work that we do here. That's not just me, that's my team that edits this and puts together show notes and gets this out every week. We are excited to have some really great episodes here going into spring. And then if you are interested in having these conversations outside of your own head, we do have a Facebook group called Farming on Purpose Podcast, where you can have some of these conversations, introduce your farm, tell us what you're thinking about, what conversations are important that you're having right now. I think that any time that we can learn from each other in that way is beneficial. And if you're here listening to this podcast, I know that you're having similar conversations and thoughts to other listeners. So if you want to be part of that conversation, join us in the podcast Facebook group. You can also have those conversations on Patreon on that platform. And lastly, I just want to really thank you guys for listening. Whenever I do a solo episode, I'm really putting a lot of myself out into the world, and sometimes that's harder for me to do than others. So I just appreciate that you listen to the podcast on a weekly basis. And if there are topics that you want to hear more about, I would love to hear from you. Have a great week, everybody.
If you've enjoyed spending time with us today, please take a moment to review the podcast on Apple Podcasts or join the conversation on social media. Do you have a topic you would like to discuss or know someone with a story to share? Apply to be a guest on the podcast at farmingonpurpose.com. You can follow the host of Farming on Purpose, Lexi, on your favorite social media platforms for more content by searching for Farming on Purpose. And remember, if you look around your table and aren't inspired by the people there, it's time to find a new seat.